as usual, as you've probably gotten used to, I'm going to thank a bunch of people, which is important because without their help, we could not do this lecture series. Especially we couldn't bring in people from outside, people who are not at the University of New Mexico, which is of particular relevance today. So some of the people I want to thank are, first and foremost, of course, well, actually, first and foremost, I want to thank Dr. Stewart and Loyola Chastain, the people who work for International Studies Institute, and the people who did the majority of the work for putting together the whole lecture series. Ian Stewart did most of the inviting and the arranging for who was going to go when and so forth, and Loyola Chastain did a lot of the work in terms of getting people settled with hotels and payment and air flight, flights and so forth. So without their help, I mean, this wouldn't happen at all. The other group I definitely have to thank is the New Mexico Humanities Council, who's provided the bulk of the funding for this. And the New Mexico Humanities Council is here right in town. They're on Silver in Nob Hill. More importantly, though, they have a website, and you should definitely check it out because they sponsor a lot of things around the city, around the state for that matter, of all different types. I mean, there's competitions, there's talks, there's like plays, performances of that nature. There's lots and lots of different things, art exhibitions and so forth. Some other groups I want to thank are a bunch of departments. So the Department of Anthropology, Department of Africana Studies, Department of English, Honors College, Foreign Languages and Literatures, Department of History. All those organizations help contribute for tonight's lecture. And then there's one other group I want to thank, but I'm not going to thank them immediately because I'm instead going to introduce the person who's going to be introducing our speaker. So I want to introduce to you Jacob Templeton, who is a junior here at UNM. He's majoring in political science. He's minoring in history, and he's aiming to get a certificate in NSSP, the National Security Studies Program. And he's also the treasurer of the World Affairs Delegation. And that's the other group that has helped support this. So World Affairs Delegation, they do a lot of work, especially with Model UN type stuff. But they're interested in international events in general, learning more about them, getting involved in certain activities. So once again, I would invite you at the end, if you want to know more about it, here's the person to talk to.
Thank you. Dr. Kelly Askew is a professor of anthropology, Afro-American, and African studies at the University of Michigan. She received her PhD from Harvard and has spent over 20 years studying in Tanzania and Kenya. Her two primary research topics are the use of poetic arts as a means of political populist engagement and the formalization of property rights post-socialism. Dr. Askew has produced two films, Poetry in Motion, on Zanzibar's oldest orchestra, and The Chairman and the Lions, which won multiple awards. We are very lucky to have her here today to speak about peacemaking in Tanzania. Please give her a warm welcome.
Thank you very, very much to all of you, to the International Studies Institute, to the New Mexico Humanities Council, to the students for coming. This is a great honor to be able to be here and to share my work with you. This is part of a book project, and so I really do welcome this chance to think with you and ask for you to give me helpful feedback, as I know I will learn from you in turn. So I was asked to speak about poetry as a form of peacemaking. And poetry has been so integral to the political culture of Tanzania that I thought, well, I should be able to do this. But because the book is talking about post-socialist poetics, poetics being sort of the ways in which language solidifies to produce certain ideas and gets reiterated, and poetry being one way in which that happens, but they are two different things. I thought I'd have to go back a bit and try to look at what is sort of the broader discussion about poetry in relation to politics, in relation to philosophy. So I'm going to go through a quick run through Western philosophic traditions, and here are some names that some of whom should be familiar to you. Although in contemporary Western countries, rarely does one draw a connection between poetry and politics, this is an aberration when you take into account global perspective and historical perspective. Plato, Aristotle, Vico, Heidegger, Ricoeur, Rancière, these are a few only of the philosophers from the Western tradition. Note they're all male, problem, but there we go. Who have accorded unique powers to poetry, or consider it a vehicle for conveying a truth, a way of being that transcends everyday realities and common knowledge. The perceived link between poetry and the power to bring into being, to create, is what alarmed the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. In his famous text, The Republic, Plato argued for the necessity of banishing poets, for fear of the power of poetry to bewitch the soul, to subvert reason and arouse intense emotions, all of which pose threats to the political order. So for him, those of you who have studied some philosophy, perhaps you know, he focuses a lot of conversation on this idea of mimesis, by which is meant imitation, to represent something. And for him, art, all forms of art, not just poetry, poetry being one of these art forms, art is 3 times removed from reality, because the real deal is the ideal that exists in our minds, that's like maybe in a divine form somewhere. That is the real reality, and that there's a divine form, an ideal form of table, of which this is one imitation of that ideal. And then when I paint a table, that is now 3 times removed from the original. So art is always secondary and tertiary, 3 times removed from reality. By then, not so important to him because his focus is on the ideal states. Poetry in particular, as I said, is a formidable force for him because it can subvert reason by affecting our emotions. And that's why he argued that it needs to be subject to strict political control. For him, art is mimesis, poetry is mimesis, and so he took a very dim view of art and poetry in particular. His student, but let me actually go back and use 3 Greek terms that I'll refer to over the course of this discussion. So mimesis, I've introduced to you already, which Plato focuses heavily on. Aesthesis is where we get our term aesthetics. And people think of aesthetics as being the study of beauty, the study of form. But in fact, aesthetics comes from the Greek to mean perception, to perceive, and especially to perceive through our senses. But perception is really the focus of aesthetics. How we perceive something, whether we perceive something as beautiful or not, it tends to be how it's used. But the original Greek term is aesthesis. And then poesis, which is the verb to create, to make, to bring into being. And our word poetry comes from poesis. So the word poetry actually means to create, to bring something new into being. So Plato's student Aristotle identified, he took a turn away from his teacher's understanding of art and poetry in particular, because for him, it can not just reflect what is, but also what might be. So for Aristotle, art, and especially again, he also wrote voluminously on poetry. One of his key texts is called Poetics. Art can represent any of these 3 things. Number 1, the kinds of things which were or are the case, which is actually what's there, reality, past or present. Number 2, the kinds of things people say and think about, which would mean collective ideas. It could be collective ideas about democracy or about religion. And 3, the kinds of things that ought to be the case. In other words, idealized conceptions of the world, a better world, one that isn't, but might be. So for him, poetry has a special range of linguistic registers that distinguishes it from ordinary speech, and that enables it to have this greater heightened power. I don't think we have too much time, so I'll just say the poet's function is to describe not the thing that happened, not the kind of thing that might happen, but what is possible, what is necessary. And so that is where Aristotle takes us. Italian philosopher Giambattista Vico understands poetry as a form of wisdom that eludes scientific methodology and arises from universalist experiences. So here we're getting to this idea that will become even stronger in Heidegger of there's this truth, there's this sense of being, there's this universal thing out there that poets tap into and can convey through their work. So Vico talks a lot about poetic wisdom. He has a book called The New Sciences, which has whole sections devoted to poetry, poetry and metaphysics, poetry and logic, poetry and reason. Martin Heidegger, German philosopher, considers poetry an act of creating. So we're getting back to this idea again of poesis, but of projecting truth. He says poetry is the saying of the world and of the earth. It's the arena of conflict, back to our theme of peacemaking and conflict, and thus the place of all nearness and remoteness of the gods. Poetry is the saying of that which is hidden, that which is concealed, and it projects beyond that veil of hiddenness. So it reveals truth, it reveals being, and it illuminates that which is concealed. Now that brings us back to that second term I mentioned, aesthesis, the ability to perceive. So for Heidegger, he's getting us in the direction I want to go of poetry being a way to allow us to perceive that which we had not perceived before. He writes, to write poetry is taking measure of something, understood in the strict sense of the word by which man first receives the measure for the breadth of his being. Hard kind of, a lot of philosophical strangeness there, excuse me, but nonetheless trying to get at this idea that poetry reveals, it illuminates, it takes measure, it allows us to perceive that which was hidden. I'm sorry. And the aesthetic context, this is a commentator on Greek philosophy, the aesthetic context creates special cognitive conditions of contemplation and has corresponding consequences for the viewer's emotional response. So here we see you come full circle back to Plato's concern that poetry speaks to your emotions and overrides reason. But if you think of it as perception through emotion but through logic as well, it can do both. I will skip ahead, but recur, similar arguments here. Poetic language allows beings to come into, to appear. But here, this is interesting, again, to our theme of conflict and peacemaking. For recur, there's a violent act when the poet is receiving this universal access to truth, being, whatever you want to call it. The poet's way of giving himself up to meaning, of being sort of a conduit through which truth and universal principles can pass. But that this is a capture. The poet is captured by this truth. Its violent particularity of the poet is expressed in the very moment that he abandons himself and surrenders himself to uncovered being. That the poet is the violent man who forces things to speak. It is poetic abduction. So as the poet is himself or herself abducted into this connection with some greater being or truth, they also force words out, which is another form, you could say, of violence. So poets thus employ their verbal artistry to capture meaning and truths, to force things to speak, to render power and knowledge unconcealed. So explains this set of philosophers from the Western tradition. Beyond the Western tradition lies copious evidence of the value that other cultures have placed on the powers of poetry. Indeed, the oldest known literary text, the Epic of Gilgamesh, dating from 1200 BCE, is an epic poem. East Asia has one of the oldest continuous poetry traditions, dating from at least as early as the Confucian text, Classic of Poetry from the 11th to 7th centuries BCE, a collection of some 305 poems that continue to be quoted today. And in the Japanese imperial court of the 11th century, everyone in court was required to be able to compose poems. That's how the court business was conducted. Hundreds of poems would be exchanged in a single day in the imperial court. The more delicately indirect, The more a poem resonated, the better it was. So we know the Western tradition, Asian tradition. I shift now to Africa. Here we also have a hermeneutical tradition emerging, and one of the key spokespeople who I would refer you to is Ngugi wa Thiong'o of Kenya. He's a novelist, he's a playwright, he's a political activist, he served time in jail. He's one of East Africa's most prominent literary heroes. And he followed a revolutionary path set by others before him, writing also his prison diary. As can be seen, here are some of his texts, and the one that I'm going to be focusing on is this one, Pen Points, Gun Points, and Dreams, towards a critical theory of the arts and the state in Africa. He also engages with the question of art and political efficacy and the vexed relationship between art, poetry, and power. For him, the artist serves as a mirror to reflect what's there. So that is kind of what Plato was saying, mimesis. It's representing what exists, but a different kind of mirror that illuminates, allows you to see things that you hadn't seen before. He engages Plato head-on in his writing, and he argues that the situation in Africa raises in turn wider issues of the relationship between art and the state of art, the rulers and the writers, between Plato's guardians of the state and his mindless possessed who sing the power divine. Writing is more dangerous than killing, says the state. And Ngugi outlines in elegant fashion 4 features of art that make it dangerous as far as states are concerned. But here again, here's this idea of a mirror, but not just any mirror. The artistic process is like a mirror lodged in the consciousness. It is a complex mirror with an X-ray component to it. It reflects both the surface and the deeper nature of things. So why are states threatened by art and poets in particular, going all the way back to Plato? Number 1, this element of poiesis, creation, bringing into being that which was not there. And that is equivalent to what God has done, or gods do. They bring into being, they create. And that is what he says that states want to retain a monopoly on. They don't want other people bringing things into being. They want to have exclusive control over that. The second aspect of art is what he calls the Socratic aspect. Art has more questions than it has answers. If you know how Socrates thought, it was always through question and dialogue. Art starts with a position of not knowing and seeking to know. There may be answers implied in the question, but mostly hints, open-ended possibilities, not certitudes. The state, on the other hand, has plenty of answers and hardly any questions. The third aspect is what I would again call the mirror effect, mirroring, but what Ngugi calls the Andersenian aspect. Who is he drawing on here? Hans Christian Andersen, in particular the story, The Emperor with No Clothes. So if you remember that story, there's an emperor who's so all-powerful, so omnipotent, no one dares criticize him or contradict him, and decides one day to go about with no clothes on, but says, isn't what I'm wearing just lovely? And everyone sycophantically says, yes, it's beautiful, until a child comes forth and says, he's naked. So that is the speaking truth to power aspect that he's calling the Andersenian aspect, that states are frightened of. They don't want artists revealing that which they want hidden. Finally, Ngugi calls the fourth aspect its Munchian aspect, drawing from the famous artist with this painting. Here he says that art tries to restore voice. It tries to give voice back to those who've been silenced, and that's why he calls this the Munchian aspect. So Ngugi is trying to explain why is poetry feared by states. Instead of just saying, as Plato did, that's because poetry drives the emotions. It's all these aspects of art, but especially poetry, that makes it threatening to states. So we'll take some examples now from the United Republic of Tanzania, where I work. Just so you know, Tanzania is a united republic composed of 2 formerly independent sovereign states. the Republic of Tanganyika, which is all of this, and the former People's Republic of Zanzibar, which are these two islands over here. Together, Tanganyika plus Zanzibar became the United Republic of Tanzania. Poetry pervades the national psyche of the United Republic of Tanzania. Sometimes sung, sometimes read, sometimes recited, sometimes enacted. Swahili poetry animates everyday life, national spectacles, wedding festivities, initiation rites, school performances, religious events, with both verbal artistry and philosophical discourse. It resonates in youth culture via the intoned dexterity of Swahili rappers. And it populates Swahili newspapers, websites, and social media platforms with versified opinions on all manner of things, from the most quotidian to the most global. It unites Swahili poets not only in Tanzania, but throughout East Africa, and even continents away with those in the diaspora. Interweaving social, ethical, and political concerns, ushairi, the word in Swahili for poetry, is a favored medium through which Tanzanians and Zanzibaris articulate their opinions and perusings, their musings, their invectives, their perspectives, their aspirations and apprehensions, their conundrums and their convictions. It's been intrinsic to Tanzanian political culture ever since the state was founded. So I'm going to talk about 3 cases in which poetry is very clearly can be linked to peaceful construction of first the state, and then communities of poets, and lastly to the citizenship of contemporary Tanzania. So starting with case number 1, poetry and the founding of Tanzania. In the early 1950s, as the independence movement was coming together and people were starting to lobby for independence from England, in this case. Tanzania was given over to the British. There was a lot of movement to try to insist on cultural equality as one way of making the other argument about political equality. So if you could first at least try to get Europeans to accept that you were their cultural equals, then maybe it wouldn't be so far a stretch for them to start to recognize you as political equals and give you independence. So this is a very famous song that was sung in the lead up and immediately after independence, called Our Tanzania is a Country of Happiness. And let me just play it for you so you can hear it and you can read the text there. Okay, so you get a sense this was very popular music in the early 60s, 1960s, and it was a way of having a similar sound to what Europeans were listening to, but using the vehicle of the music to, in poetic form, because that's the first verse is at the top, Nania yetu ndio wengi wa kusifiwa, pote limwenguni watu wote watambua, Tanzania yetu ndio nchi ya furaha. So very strict poetic form, singing that our country is praised throughout the world. The founding of the state of Tanzania was very much based, not even subtly, by poetic forms of organization. So there were groups of people who would come together and they'd do poetic competitions. This is pre-rap, it's not the cipher, but it is, you can see it perhaps as an ancestor of the cipher, predecessor, where poetry groups would come together and with drumming and with other forms of musical accompaniment, perform poetry for each other and oftentimes in competition with other groups. So these poetry associations have been studied by different scholars. One of them studied extensively is the Beni tradition. And it was that especially popular poetic group that spread far and wide throughout the colony when it was still a colony, and started branches that when the idea of nationalism and political independence came, those groups of poets started using their poetic form to also advocate for independence. One of these groups, born of the Beni poetry groups, is called the Tanganyika Territory African Civil Service Association. This is the very first African political group, organization to be established in Tanzania. It's founded in 1922 when it was still a colony, the colony of Tanganyika. And it had branches throughout the territory, so they could send messages to each other and make arguments and claims for political independence. 7 years later, the Tanganyika African Association. Now this is very clearly saying we as Africans are trying to lay claim to our political rights. And in 1929, that became the group that became very, very increasing in its sophistication and methods to try to argue for independence, and got the ability to at least have a representative in the gubernatorial cabinet in the colony. And then in 1954, they reformed as the Tanganyika African Union, TANU. And this is the political party that was led by the very charismatic first president of Tanzania, Julius Nyerere, and which was successful in advocating independence in 1961. So politics, poetry, and music were so aligned and intertwined that historian Terence Ranger declared, indeed, it was sometimes hard to distinguish between a branch of the African Association and an elite dance club. These things brought together. And sometimes the music was there to serve as a cover for the political organizing. Sometimes the music was there to sing liberatory thoughts. But whatever the case may be, the people who were in these groups served as the first bureaucrats of Tanzania. These are some names. Mwalimu Kihere was a nationalist poet who served as a district commissioner for several years after independence. Swahili Kibwana, another poet, politician, a secretary of TANU, became mayor of Tanga. Matias Nyampala was a very famous nationalist poet, and he was also a court magistrate. Mahmoud Hamdani bin Khalfan, a Quranic teacher, poet, also a TANU branch chairman. Isa Kitenge, the list goes on. You might note these are all men, but there were also women. Moza Ali Suleiman, Zanzibari poet, composer, prominent political activist. Mwashamu Yange, Bipir Athmani, Bibi Titi Muhammad, perhaps the most famous woman, who was not only one of the founding members of TANU in 1954, but she became the first president of the TANU Women's League. So a lot of ways in which people with poetic talents were drawn into the early years of the government. Shaban Robert, very famous nationalist poet. I don't think I have time to read this to you, but he was very much writing poetry to support the cause and support the drive for independence. Immediately after independence, we had this incident where the new president, Nyerere, convened a meeting of poets at the State House. And he said, we have a new country, we have a lot of challenges to overcome. We are a poor country, a colony, former colony. So I need you to help spread the message and get support for the work that we're doing. So 1963, 2 years after independence, you have poems like this one. Nyerere, take the steering wheel, citizens. Dawn has come, we got our republic. It had not dawned before the big thief was stalking us, the colonial power. We endured a long night before achieving it today. Nyerere, take the steering wheel, we are behind you. It's yours, your job is to lead. You've received the turban, ministers serve you, will follow your orders. We are confident, we know you're intelligent. So these kinds of poems appeared in newspapers throughout the country, spreading the news and the policies of the government. So then poetry here now is serving a different purpose, no longer sort of advocating for independence, since that was achieved, but advocating for a common platform and a common sense of belonging to this new thing called Tanzania. So that takes us to our second case. So I've introduced you now to the newspaper poets indirectly. Newspapers, at one point, there were 300 different newspapers in Tanzania. Some were dailies, some were nightlies, some only appeared on the weekends, some were devoted to sports, others to politics, but in Swahili, the national language, which was a decision, an early decision made by Nyerere to bind the whole country together. It's a country that has 122 ethnic groups, each with their own language, but he saw that even though this means probably sacrificing some of that linguistic diversity, the value of having a single language for the country to engage with each other and form a cohesive whole outweighed the loss of those languages. Linguists might not agree with that, but that was the choice that he took. And one thing that is very clear is that Tanzania has not had the kinds of civil strife and violence and conflict that all of its neighbors have experienced. So this is just a sample of what you see in Swahili newspapers, especially from the 1950s, 60s into the early 2000s. This has started to fade away. I started collecting these the moment I saw them because I found it so curious. You don't open the New York Times up or the Washington Post or any major newspaper in America and find poetry. It just isn't part of our political culture. But virtually every newspaper in Tanzania had either a page devoted to poetry or a regular section devoted to poetry. So in this newspaper had a whole page. This one is just one poem by itself. This one had two. And I've written elsewhere about the newspaper poetry and how, in a way, it's a microcosm of the whole newspaper because it have poems talking about international news, domestic news, advice columnists in verse, or obituary poems when somebody has passed away. Or this one makes me laugh, this guy, he says, "I am Ali Ndundike. If you hang out with me, you'll see my lovely personality. I have a beautiful smile. I would make a beautiful husband for somebody." It's even got personal ads in poetic form. So the poetry pages, you find anything and everything there, riddles and enigma poems posed that others might write responses to. So this is one poem that I've collected at least 7,000 of these poems, and there's no way that I'm going to be able to read or translate all of them, so I have to sort of haphazardly go through, search for keywords. But this one grabbed my attention because it's called Grab the Hammer and Anvil. So I'll read you the first part. Nizama za kilingondo hizi sizama za ganzi, shika fuawe na nyundo, kila uliwe muhunzi, vyuma pondeni mpondo, vipondwe vitoe banzi, tungo tunga za ujenzi, situnge za kubomoa. It's time to be alert, not to succumb to numbness. Take up anvil and hammer, all you blacksmiths. Pound the iron into shape, removing all scrap. Compose poetry that constructs, not destroys. So here the blacksmiths are not blacksmiths, but wordsmiths. The poet is saying we poets have a responsibility to help construct, build new things, bring about good institutions and ideals and ideologies in our society, not write poetry that causes division and causes destruction. So that's the kind of thing one finds. But in addition to that, so you have poetry serving this purpose. You have poets populating the government hierarchy. But you also have a community of poets that policed each other and formed a very large, powerful bloc. They had their own poets' court. And after years of studying this, I only came to learn about this past summer, so I'm very excited to share it with you, because there was actually a name for it, the Baraza Kuu. Baraza means court or tribunal, and this is the high court for poets. And what is interesting to me is that in this venue, because the thing is about poetry is people would sometimes write these competitive poems back and forth, and sometimes would be demeaning of each other. And when it was felt that a poem had breached a level that was now not civil anymore, and thereby not appropriate, not acceptable, they could be charged in the poet's court. So in the past, there was a judge for poets who could issue judgments that all poets would respect. The name of their court was the Baraza Kuu, and they had a chief judge, Rashidi Mfaume. In parentheses, it says here, Chifu Jaji, which is Swahili for chief judge. And he was in Kipawa near the airport. So it was the Baraza Kuu Kipawa. He was a poet whose own poetic title, and that was something that I didn't get to mention, but all poets had their poetic name. It wasn't a pseudonym, because they published their real names right next to their poetic name, but they all had some sort of name that they thought sort of reflected who they were. His was very clearly chief judge. And he died in the early 90s. Some of his poems I happened to find in my collection of 7,000 poems. He could issue judgments like forbidding someone from composing poetry for a period of time. They'd be banned from the radio and from the newspapers. And everyone was obedient to the judgments of the court. He would oversee and resolve disputes among poets. If a poet would complain that another poet had abused him or her in their poetry, they would be summoned. They would have advocates. The advocates were all poets. The arguments had to be made in poetic form. The judge would have to issue the judgment in poetic form. Everything was done in poetry. And this was the high court for poets across the entire nation, with the exception of Zanzibar, which had its own court. And I was given an example of a poem written by the chief judge about drinking tea and filling up on it, which is a metaphor for referring to a case that he had about two poets who he found both guilty of wrongdoing. So I found this one poem of his, and I did a quick pass at translating it, but his name is Rashidi Mfaume. The name of his poem that he composed is Rashidi, I don't understand this case. So here it's actually like a poem about him being judge, overseeing a case where he felt the claimant didn't do justice to the whole process by bringing proper evidence. So he goes on and says, Mr. Juma Saidi, you seek your rights, but not from Rashidi. He's speaking in third person about himself, whom you've consulted. Rashidi can't come to a decision on this case. I simply don't understand it. I can't render a judgment based on what you've brought. I'm surprised at what you've submitted. Why don't you just come here in person to explain your situation yourself? I've written 6 verses. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I have emphasized over and over that I don't understand this case. So the poet court is another case of using poetry to resolve differences now, not at the most national level, but at a community level among poets. My third case is political poetry today, which is most commonly found in the form rap. Here's a relatively recent picture of what I've just told you, the vast numbers of newspapers one finds at a newspaper vendor in Tanzania. But I have this up here not just to show you all the different newspapers, but to show you this woman who adorns the cover of every one. This woman, her name is, Amina Chifupa. And she was a famous DJ who was the first person in Tanzania to take the risk of playing rap music on the airwaves. At the time, there had just been the first private radio station introduced. This was around 1992, 93. Up until that, there had been only one radio station, the government Radio Tanzania. And so once there was this new private station, Clouds FM, she was the first one to say, you know what, the music that's really popular in the streets is rap music. So she started playing it on the air. And you see these layers of meta language where people are talking about the language, about what they're doing. So one of the famous rappers that she would play is a man named Professor J. And I'm bad because I forgot to include his image, but he's on the poster for this talk. Professor J had a song in 2001 called Tears, Sweat, and Blood. And in the song, he's enacting an imaginary conversation with an elderly person who's questioning him about rap music and saying, this sounds to me like music of hooligans and youth gone astray. And Professor J asserts in his song that rap is not only not a bad influence on youth, but on the contrary is the best instrument to expose injustice, inequality, and all the other problems that affect Tanzania's society. It is also a medium to create consciousness about these problems in order to solve them. So Amina Chifupa played Professor J, played other rappers at a time that it was completely foreign and something new. And she became so popular and her show so popular, and she popularized rap and made it normal, made it acceptable, such that when it came time for parliamentary elections, she was given a seat in parliament at a very young age. Problem is that she decided that she would use her political position to fight her primary platform, which was against the legal drug trade, because she said so many of the youth in Tanzania are falling prey to heroin addiction and cocaine addiction, more heroin than anything else. And she says, and I will make it my business to find out who are the big drug lords who are affecting the youth in society like this. And she says, and I already actually have a list, and I know who they are, and I will use my parliamentary position to find a way to undermine what they're doing. 6 months later, she was dead. And so as a result, this is right after she died, and you see all the newspapers are covering her death. And she is a hero still in Tanzania, such that most rappers include a picture of her or a reference to her saying that we must stand up for truth against wrong, just as Amina Chifupa did. So she's become very much a hero. I'm going to give you an example of Professor J in his early years. And what's interesting about this song is that he's pretending to be a politician.
Tambua mawazo yako ni nguzo ya maendeleo. Piga vita masikini kwa faida kesho na leo. Kazi ya kujikwamua ni jukumu letu wenyewe. Yaani tupige vita maskini mimi na wewe. Sinapofika serikali ni kwa ajili ya wananchi na sisi ndio wananchi, lazima tuijenge nchi.
So these are two rappers, as you know in rap tradition, Professor J featuring so-and-so, and this person he's featuring is Mwana Fa, whose stage name Mwana Falsafa, the child of philosophy, is his name for himself. And Professor J took the name professor because he wants to teach people, he wants to allow them to see, and he has a long explanation for how he's going to do that in another song. But here they're saying Tanzania is not for just the rich, it's for everybody, and together we must work together to build the nation. But they're pretending to be politicians who are not fully honest, wearing these big suits and everything else. Time passes, 2010, Professor J is elected a minister of parliament. And that's what he is today. And yet he still manages to release songs every now and again, and people are hoping that he's going to actually implement in practice what he had promised to do when he was a rapper, never imagining in a million years that he would actually become a politician. Let me give you one other example. This is a case of two other rappers, Kala Jeremiah featuring Roma, also pretending to be politicians. But I want you to note You don't even have to know what they're talking about, but just watch what they've enacted. Nchi ya ahadi means country of promises.
Watu wako wanauliza kutoka nyuma ya mtaa, hivi Mtwara siku na gesi mbona wanapigia mkaa? Kupika kwa mkaa ni gari ya Mtanzania, gesi ni kuja kama baraka Mungu ametushushia. Tusimame kuilinda amani ya nchi wa Tanzania ndio moja. Muone mradi wa gesi bado mbichi. Je, unaujua mgodi wa Nyamongo, watoto wadogo risasi kadhaa nyuma ya mgongo, watu wamepigika hawana kitu wanakunywa gongo. Mgodi wa Nyamongo na utambua vizuri, tumepokea malalamiko toka pande zote mbili. Wawekezaji wanadai wakazi wamekuwa jeuri na wananchi wanalalamika wawekezaji ndio viburi. Umeme Tanzania ni tatizo kwa ujumla maisha ya.
Okay, so what you can hopefully see there is that they're enacting a very critical citizenry. That these are not just soaking up the words of their politicians, accepting at face value whatever the politicians are dishing out. They're enacting, having audiences critically sort of assess, understand or not understand what these politicians are trying to do, and challenging them on that. So if we get back to the worries of the philosophers and others who worry about the power of art, in particular poetry, we find that perhaps Ngugi was right, that the threats that states deem coming from poetry, art, all forms of art, but in particular poetry, is that they are creative and insist repeatedly on the value of life and responsibility of the state to ensure a good life for its people. So they sing about this, they write about this, and they're constantly putting the state, calling on the state to respond to the needs of the citizenry. 2, they question the state of affairs, the continued corruption, the negative health impact, the negative health outcomes and educational outcomes, high unemployment, the questionable outcomes of privatization, who it's benefiting, et cetera, et cetera. So questioning whether or not the state is taking the country in a good direction or not. 3rd, they mirror the realities on the ground. Mimesis, again, representing what they see, but also by so doing, asking their audiences to see things with a different light, to perceive what is going on, things that are hidden, pulling them out, calling them out in the open. So as Ngugi said, it's not just a mirror, it's like a mirror with an X-ray looking deep into underlying root causes and revealing the corruption that exists. Finally, they restore voice to the voiceless, to the oppressed. Here in this video, having the audience speak out or show that they're not just there to listen, as in the first video, but now, fast forward ahead of time, that it's the case of every person to stand up and to speak truth to power. So as noted elsewhere, the power of poetic language to mold ideas or to inspire fresh ways of thinking had earlier moved the famous English poet P.B. Shelley to declare that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. They create the words and ideals that will govern the future. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
So go ahead. Does anyone have any questions? Here, okay.
In the interest of kind of answering the question of is poetry part of, or is poetry like an effective form of peacemaking in this situation? Would you say that it's cathartic enough to rap or to do poetry? Is it because our class is a lot about that, right? The peacemaking after the class is a lot about how effective is that in peacemaking and stuff like that. Is it cathartic enough for them to only rap about it like that, or do you foresee any in the future, not necessarily conflict or necessarily, but is it enough to simply rap about it? Because we talked about a little bit like how it's different in the United States, the criticizing of people or of like being blunt about something. And I would say that for me, here will never be enough to simply sing about it or rap about it or do poetry about something. You have to say it.
So, can everyone hear? No, definitely not. Okay, so I'll condense it a little bit. So the question is about, is this rapping or is this poetry? When you're talking about peacemaking, when you're talking about diffusing tensions, is it enough to just speak in verse, to rap and so forth? Is that cathartic enough to satisfy the needs for peacemaking or conflict diffusing in Tanzania specifically? You're asking about.
So I get this question a lot. What is the political efficacy of poetry? And I've had someone say, like when I was especially talking about the newspaper poetry, oh, let them write poetry, and the government can continue to do as it wishes. But if the first stage of political action is political awareness, that's where the importance of having wordsmiths help perceive, help draw out that which is being hidden. So you have to first have knowledge of what the situation is before you can then act upon it. And another thing is that when I was in the early stages of this project, I used to just really avoid this whole thing about emotion and Plato's idea about emotion, and it just moves people and they can't think. Why? Because in discussions about Africa, too often people think of Africa as the non-rational as compared to the West, which is the rational. And there's so much work on spirit possession and trance. I'm like, I don't want to go there. I don't want my work to go there. I'm not supporting that line of argument at all. But then I had a very famous political philosopher listen to a talk I gave, and she said, Kelly, stop being so anti-emotion, because what drives people to take to the streets? You're following the news. Protests right now in Argentina and Chile and all over the place, right? What causes people to take themselves into the streets in Lebanon is feeling enough outrage about what the situation is to actually take action. So that if the awareness making is the first stage, that then drives you to feel enough anger or cause to take up the action and do something, that then is the next stage of the political action that we see as people taking to the streets, strikes, conflict on that order. These are necessary precursor steps. Yes?
My question is, what do you see to be the biggest weakness of using poetry for peacekeeping and peacemaking in Tanzania?
So the question is, what's the biggest weakness of using poetry for such purposes?
So I've talked about some examples that are very direct, like the judge saying, I don't understand your case. There's nothing very metaphorical about that. A lot of the poetry is highly metaphorical and allows for different readings. That's both a weakness and a strength, because it's not direct, you have to sit and figure it out, but it also is a defense, because I go, well, in the previous class I talked about a poem that was very, very popular, sung poem called Captains of Boats. Why are captains of boats at the back? Pilots of airplanes, drivers of buses, drivers of cars are at the front. We want to see you at the front so that we see where we're going and we have faith in where you're taking us. So that is very clearly and has been used as a critique of politicians. We don't want backdoor deals, we want you in front, we can see where you're going. And the reason why it's a good thing to have a metaphor in there is that if they're accused of being anti-government, they can say, I was just singing a song about captains and boats. You can hide behind that metaphor. But then it also can mean that sometimes you're not being interpreted for what you want people to discern. So maybe the metaphor can go both ways. It's a double-edged sword. But people are so well tuned to the metaphorical capacity of poetry that they know that there's something there and they need to figure out, and often we'll spend time together. It used to be that, and people have written about how orality is supposed to be Africa and print culture is more, again, that's another false dichotomy, because there's been a long-standing print culture in Africa going way back, but even there's orality mixed in, so that's why it's also not right to separate these two. Because around every newspaper vendor stand, you'll have people reading together and then debating whatever they're reading. And that could be the poetry, that could be the written articles. I think I got off topic, but I hope that helps you, that sometimes the lack of direction, the desire for having your message somewhat cloaked in order to protect you, especially in a punitive environment where you might be end up in jail or worse if you're caught speaking too overtly against the government, that requires your audience to think and discern what you're doing. So that can be seen as a weakness. It's also a strength.
Do you think that poetry cultures of expressing like the political views will ever fade away from Tanzania due to the fear of like consequences or punishment that that can affect them?
So the question is, will this fade away? The newspaper poetry is already fading away. I have been. This wasn't what I went to study for my dissertation, but I was so shocked to find so much poetry, and I just kept saving it whenever I came across it, thinking, I'll study that someday, and someday came, and I'm studying it now, and now when I go back and interview editors of newspapers, I'm like, what's happening? Why don't I see it every day? They say, well, people aren't bringing us poetry as much as before. People, I think, have moved their poetry into other venues. So now there are a lot of blogs for Swahili poetry, there's websites for Swahili poetry. They're not taking it to the newspapers in the same way as before. And I'm only just starting to skim the surface of how much is out there on the internet. But there's a safety that comes with that too. I mean, you're not, you're censored when you bring your poetry to the newspaper. If they view it as too critical of the government, even if it's hidden in layers of metaphor, they won't publish it. Whereas if you take it online, you can publish what you want. So the poetry is going in different directions, and I don't mourn that because the history of poetic arts in East Africa has always come up with new forms, new styles, rap being one that's currently very popular now, but even rappers are having to take a step back. I will say that in terms of efficacy, I also asked rappers that. Do you feel like your poems have been used to bring about change, and can you give me an example of one? And one rapper said, well, in one of my rap songs, I talked about how this one bank is a terrible bank. You have to stay in line for hours on end to get any service, and yet that's the bank that most of the poor people go to. So why can't they improve their business? And he said, one day I was walking along the street, and everyone knew this guy, he's a rapper, and some guy came running up to him and said, I'm the bank manager from the NMB, and I want you to know that we've greatly improved our service. Please, could you write something that shows that we've improved now? So somebody got touched by that poem, but that was one example on a very small scale.
One last question.
Okay, so I'm wondering if poetry as like a form of media, is that kind of immune to manipulation? In our country, we have a saying of fake news. Is there fake poetry and bias at all, or anything like that?
So, excuse me. The question is poetry as a medium subject to manipulation like other things? So, in other words, is there fake poetry, like fake news?
And I would say yes, that poets can also subscribe to multiple ideologies. There's just not one. Despite what Heidegger said about truth and this tapping into some, cosmic being, you have poets of every political stripe. And so some of them will write rather sycophantic praise of a government that others will view as pandering in order to get perhaps professional gigs or, and this goes way back in history. Praise singers, praise poets were always attached to all major kingdoms in Europe, in North Africa, in West Africa, throughout the world. You had somebody sing your praises. That role of poetry still remains as well.
And I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but I'm just going to relate briefly. There's a fairly famous African folktale about a king who asks a poet to come make a song for him about him, and the poet does. And then when the king says, "What do you want?" and the poet asks for a very small payment, and the king still gets upset. He says, "Oh, it was such an honor to write about me. How dare you ask for that much?" and has him beat up and so forth. So then the poet composes a second song about how the king is a jerk, how he's a Philistine, and he doesn't appreciate good poetry, and he's violent and so forth. And the second song's so popular that everyone starts singing it in his kingdom. And everywhere the king goes, he's hearing these people saying how stupid the king is and how mean the king is. So the king goes back to the poet and he says, "You've got to stop this song. It's really embarrassing." And the poet says, "You can't stop poetry. If people like it, they like it. It's out of my hands. Tough luck." So with that said, I would invite you to do 3 things. 1, leave the feedback things, fill them out and leave them wherever you are sitting. It doesn't matter. 2, come up and ask more questions if you'd like. We're not going to flee here immediately. And the 3rd thing is to thank Professor Askew one more time for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.